I wonder if we could just start with that word irony, because it is a word that I think a lot of folks don't really understand. In my own mind, if someone asked me what's the definition of irony, I don't think I'd be able to come up with a definition off the top of my head. It's more something that I feel than more something I can specifically describe. So when you're using this word, the irony that you find in the Gospel of Matthew, the irony that you find when you look at what women are doing in the Gospel of Matthew, what does that term mean to you?
I have adopted one particular version of understanding irony. I think other people would talk about it in different fashions. I'm sure there are many ways to talk about irony, but the particular method that I have adopted from my work with methodology and irony is to think of reality on two levels, a lower level and an upper level. And the lower level is the level that is accessible to all of the actors on the scene, what is visible to people walking on the earth in their normal lives. The upper level is then the God level. It's the level that is not available to everyone. It will be available to the perceptive reader, but the upper level is essentially the God level of the story and what's happening at the God level. So, for example, let me just give you an illustration. The story that I have worked with more frequently than any, I think, than any other story in the Gospel of Matthew, which is the story of Herod and the child. On the lower level of this story, we see a picture of Herod, who is someone who has all kinds of power. He has a title of power. He is the king. He has a whole era that is identified by him in the days of Herod the king. So it's a whole era that can be marked by Herod. He has political clout. His moods affect all Jerusalem. When he is upset, all Jerusalem gets upset with him. He has the power to call people, to call them to summon people. He has the power to question people, and he has the power to send people out. He is astute. He recognizes the implications of political circumstances. When there is somebody that is identified as the one born who is the king of the Jews, he realizes that that has implications for him. He is cunning. He can act secretly. He's extremely cynical. He doesn't care whom he deceives. He doesn't care how many people he destroys. And if you want to start building connections with the real world that we live in, you can start building connections at whatever stage you wish. And ultimately, he has the power of life and death over people. And he seeks to destroy people, and he can destroy people, and he does destroy people. So all of these things are things on the lower level of the story. But as we read the story, we discover that Herod, first off, is terrified by the child. He's terrified by a child. He is tricked by the Magi. And ultimately, he cannot achieve his goals. And what is even worse for him, he doesn't have any reason for understanding why he cannot achieve his goals. He has no idea that there is such a thing as an angel of the Lord who is getting in the way and is bringing things about. And ultimately, he cannot save his own life, because 3 times within the same narrative, we learn about the death of Herod. So in the end, it is Herod who has one goal and one goal only, and that is to destroy the child. And he nevertheless discovers or doesn't discover that he cannot meet his goal, and he surely doesn't discover why he cannot achieve his goal. So, on the upper level of the story, which we can observe as we read Matthew's narrative, um, things are very different than they appear.
Hmm.
And yeah, go ahead.
No. I'm reminded of that. What's that line? I don't know which psalm it is, but it's something like, the God in heaven laughs at the designs of men.
Yes, in Psalm 2. Psalm 2
Yeah.
you have. Hmm.
Yeah.
And that is a very significant psalm for me. I think about that psalm and use that psalm or refer to that psalm frequently because God is laughing at Herod's attempt to get rid of the child. While on the one hand, Matthew invests Herod with a lot of power on the surface, elsewhere within his narrative, he takes that power back. And he shows Herod to be a figure who is ultimately powerless. I was fascinated by what happens when you look at the question of women who have very little power in society at all. Now, the women of empire, of course, had power, but the women subject to empire had virtually none. And to see how in virtually each case Matthew finds a way to validate women over against empire. And the most striking was the story of the women at the cross and at the tomb. And at the tomb, you have some of the most biting irony that you have anywhere in the Gospel of Matthew, because literally, visually, you have a picture of women who are standing on their feet. These are women that had no power to stop the crucifixion. They could only stand at a distance and they could only sit at the tomb and observe. They didn't even have the physical power or the political clout to do what Joseph did, which was to go to Pilate and get the body and then take the body and bury it. They didn't have any of that power. All they could do was sit at the tomb and observe. And they came to observe the tomb. And here are the women standing tall and straight with their eyes open and their ears open. And guess where empire is? Empire is lying flat on its face on the ground in a dead faint. I mean, it's hard to imagine that Matthew didn't intend that irony.
What do you
Uh,
mean by the empire on its face and it did faint?
that were the guards.
Oh, I see.
The
Oh, right.
guards.
Sure,
The
yeah.
guards. It. Let me get the text for you. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. Tell me,
That's
just
great.
tell me that
That is great.
Matthew didn't recognize
No,
the
no,
irony that's going on here and the irony that
sure.
he put into the account. So there is empire lying flat on its face on the ground, while the women, who are the most powerless people in society, are standing on their feet and listening to the angel of the Lord and eventually meeting the risen Jesus and worshiping the risen Jesus. So I rest my case.
No, it is remarkable. And when I'm hearing, you're using the word irony, I'm thinking of the more colloquial phrase, flipping the script. Pilate is the guy that the empire has designated to be there, so presumably he's the insightful one, but it's his wife who has the correct insight. The
It
flipped,
is his wife. Yes,
the,
it
the
does flip
script
the
gets
script.
flipped.
Mhm.
Uh,
That's one way
the
to talk about it.
Yeah, the agents of empire are there. Uh, these are soldiers. Presumably they've seen
Yes, they are.
combat, but presumably they've seen some kind of warfare, rough stuff, but they flee. The women, as you say, are there standing tall, and the disciples also are not there.
I'm also talking about the men who are the disciples, because they aren't there either. They have disappeared way back in the Garden of Gethsemane, long verses ago. And they are nowhere, which is exactly why. And that's another piece of the irony. There were so many levels of the irony that I had to lay out for the women at the tomb, at the resurrection. And one of the ironies, one of the keen ironies, is that we need the women there precisely because the disciples aren't there. If the disciples had been there, the women wouldn't have to go and tell them. But the women are given this command twice, once by the angel of the Lord, and the other time by Jesus himself, to go and tell my disciples. So they wouldn't have to do that if the disciples had been there, but the disciples have long since disappeared. And so the women also are standing straight and tall against the male disciples of Jesus, who don't show up until they have apparently gotten the word from the women. The other intriguing irony of this final story in the Gospel of Matthew is the story about message versus message, because this is a story about message versus message. The women are given one message. They are supposed to go and tell the disciples that Jesus has been raised from the dead and he's going to meet you in Galilee. That's their message, and they have been given that message by an angel of the Lord, this angel that comes down and undoes all of the security measures of empire. That's the other irony there, that empire has secured the tomb with this big stone, and the angel comes, and as if to rub it in everybody's faces, the angel comes, not only removes the stone, but sits down on it as if to say, take that. And so that's one thing. But the message versus message, the women have the message about the resurrection of Jesus. The soldiers also get a message. They go to the chief priests and the Jewish leaders, and they get their message, and they are told to say, you must say that his disciples came at night and stole the body while we were sleeping. Well, you can tell, and they gave lots of money to the soldiers to tell this story. Well, you can guess that there are a couple of major problems with this story. First of all, if they were sleeping, they would never have known that the disciples came to steal the body. Secondly, why would they have been paid big money, a huge bribe, to tell something if it was something that was actually true? So it is the women whose story we never even hear. We don't hear their voice at all in chapter 28. But they get the message, they take the message to the disciples, and it is their message, which is the true message, which wins out at the end. And the risen Jesus is standing on the mountain with his disciples as if to say, here I am, the women's message is correct. While the big lie, this is also a story about the big lie. Talk about history resembling current day reality. This is the big lie that the soldiers have been given to tell. And it says, and this big lie is powerful. This big lie, Matthew steps out of his role as storyteller into his own world. And he says, and this story is still being told among the Jews to this day. So he steps out of his narrative altogether to inform us that the big lie is still out there, but it sure ain't true.
What do you suppose, and here I'm just asking for your assessment, and so I'm going to ask what statement is Matthew making? Maybe he's making multiple statements, but if we imagine the first readers, I would often encourage students to think about, who read this story for the first time, and what message would they get from this in terms of power, political power, power from empire. the power of empire. But then, ironically, as you say, we see powerless people acting quite powerfully, doing quite powerful things, doing historic, things that change the course of history.
Mhm.
Women right there. We wouldn't expect women, certainly not women not married to powerful men. Um, we wouldn't expect these women to be the ones who are there at these crucial turning points. Um, and so there it is. And historically it is, I think it's kind of just stunning that this is what we read. Um, if we imagine the first people, and this is a work of imagination, but if we imagine those who read this gospel for the very first time, what message do you surmise they would have received from Matthew, in terms of power, political power, uh, however you want to think of that word?
Well, I hope that what they would have discovered from this, I can't say for sure what they actually did discover, but I hope that what they would have discovered from this is that the power of God is far greater than the power of empire. And that itself is a very ironic, it it creates a very ironic situation for the readers of this gospel, and in fact for the readers of all the gospels, because in one sense I think the gospel message itself is a profoundly ironic message. It is the message that God enacts true power and ultimate power through the medium of human suffering and death, because that is what happens to Jesus. Jesus is the one who suffers and dies instead of zapping his enemies with the angels that he could call from. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, well, I could call on legions of angels to protect me. Jesus doesn't call on legions of angels. He suffers and dies, and God validates his suffering and death by raising Jesus from the dead. And that gives the lie to the powers of empire. Empire has done its very worst or its very best. Let's put it that way. Empire has done its very best. It has executed the one that they know is their big nemesis. They can't handle this man and they have to get rid of him, so they execute him. And God says, not so fast. And here we come back to Psalm 2. God in the heavens is laughing at human attempts to create reality the way humans want to create reality. And God is saying, not so fast. I'm the one in charge. In the letter of James, James says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. So there's a motif of resistance there. But then Jesus is the one who says, do not resist the one who is evil. So I look at those two motifs as two complementary fashions for confronting the powers. And the resistance motif was the motif that Jesus played out in his ministry, in healing illness, in casting out evil spirits, in that kind of thing. That
And
was resisting the devil. And the non-resistance comes from the words of Jesus about not resisting the one who is evil. And within this, you see the motif of Jesus himself being handed over. And this language of being handed over, it's the same language that refers to tradition, but this is a different use of it. Paradidomi is the Greek verb. And this language of being handed over is used throughout the New Testament and in the Gospels as a reference to somebody being handed over to suffering and death. And so Jesus is the one who is handed over. But there is also a motif through within the New Testament itself of the fact of the way in which Jesus conquers through death, or people conquer through death. And when you were dead in trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive together with Christ when he forgave us all our trespasses, erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands. He, that is God, set this aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in, and the Greek text says in it, which I take to mean in the cross. So God disarms the rulers and authorities by means of the cross, which is where I come from when I say that I think the gospel message itself, let alone the gospel texts that we have, the gospel message is a fundamentally ironic message, which is that life comes out of death.
And as listening to you talk, once again, flipping the script, to use that phrase, everything that the cross meant to a first century Roman. And then the Christians say, we take that symbol, we adopt that symbol, we glory in this symbol. It's completely flipping the story around.
Exactly. I think you have the point.
Yeah, and taking that symbol of shame and disgrace and humiliation and turning it into something that is spiritually powerful. Yeah. Let me ask you to now sort of take off the hat of the scholar and then just put on the hat of a person now in a Mennonite congregation. And without, getting into any specific political question that's going on today, just sort of thinking in general terms, the question arises, as Mennonites, what should our relationship with the government be? And different Christian groups have different responses to this. Some say, well, we need to get into it and Christianize it, make it an instrument of, well, I don't know about an instrument of the faith, but we should get into government so that government is acting according to Christian principles. And others take a different approach, saying, hey, this world is not our home, this empire is not our empire, and we are citizens of a different country. And so we don't pledge allegiance to the flag, and not that we're opposed to the country, we pray for our rulers, but we're not going to pledge allegiance to anything but God. What would your position be if you've got a meeting and the question is asked to you? What and but your response is informed by what you've learned from the scripture, generally by what you've learned, particularly from your work with Matthew. What would you say the Christian's relationship with the government should be?
Well, let me start with the question of pledging allegiance. To me, that's an interesting story because I have come from one place to another on that question. When I was a child, I attended a local elementary school. This was before consolidation, so there were lots of small local schools, I think. And this one was a school that was in the village of Parkview, which was set up, which grew up around Eastern Mennonite College, let us say. And a lot of the people And most of the children at this school were Mennonite children, because that was who lived in the vicinity of Eastern Mennonite College. So I was in this school, and in fact, what I remember is from the year or years that I was in the upper grades. It was, when I was there, I think a 3-room school. And when I was in the upper grades, the teacher that I had was also a Mennonite woman, a very pious Mennonite woman. I mean, pious in the good sense, I guess, if you can say that. I mean, she was a faithful Mennonite woman. But every day, every single day, at the beginning of the class session, we would stand. I think we put our hands over our hearts, and we recited the pledge to the flag. And apparently, according to my memory, this was not a problem for me, nor did it become something that I went home and told to my mother, who then informed me that I shouldn't be doing this at school or something like that. As far as I'm aware, this was not an issue. I am amazed at myself, and I am amazed at the teacher that I had. I imagine that she was following rules, because this was a public school, and that was probably the instructions that she was given as a teacher in this public school. But she's long gone. I would long since no longer have her around to discuss this with. And I actually should discuss it with my sisters, because they went to the same school, and see whether they had any responses. But at that point in my life, I did not have any problem, apparently, pledging allegiance to the flag. Very shortly after that, or yes, after the 7th grade, and for several years, I went to a Bible camp that was run by a very conservative Protestant group that sent Bible teachers to the school where I went. And I remember that when I was out of 7th grade or 8th grade or 9th grade or 10th grade, one of those years, maybe it was 10th grade by that time, I remember hearing from one of the counselors at this camp, who was talking about the fact that he felt that God was calling him to enter the army and go to Vietnam, because this was the Vietnam era. And I remember that I struggled mightily. I didn't say anything. I doubt that I said anything to him. He, A, was a lot older than I was, I believe. And B, he wasn't somebody that I would have known to have talked personally to, or had the courage to talk personally to. But I remember that I struggled intensely with the idea that God could call somebody to go into the army and go to Vietnam and shoot people. And so something must have changed in my perspective in that block of time. But I know that in the present moment, I would be caught very flat-footed if I were asked, in the context of a public setting, to say the pledge to the flag, because I would not say it. I could not say it, because I do not view myself as someone who gives ultimate allegiance to any nation state. I cannot do that. And I know that giving allegiance to a nation state means that I would be willing to kill for them, and I cannot do that. I simply cannot do that. I have a different perspective. I mean, they're all levels of variations on how you respond to issues that this brings forth. And I can tell you I can give you one illustration. And that illustration is the illustration of my grandfather, who, interestingly enough, was a Bible teacher at Eastern Mennonite College and Seminary before I came along and discovered that I was teaching Bible there. And he was no longer around by the time I started. But he was a longtime Bible teacher. And I remember him saying to me, or to us, whoever he said it to, that he did not feel that he could vote in American elections because he did not feel that he could vote for the commander-in-chief of the United States Army or Armed Forces. And I respect that. I respect that deeply. That is not the decision that I have taken. I take a different view on voting because I realize that we are going to have leadership one way or the other. And if we can have better leadership rather than worse leadership, it's my job to see that we can have better leadership. It's my job to put my vote in. I vote, but I think with deep respect of my grandfather, who was trying his best to be faithful to what he understood of the meaning of voting in the United States, and how that related to the fact that he could not enter the army or take up weapons to kill another human being.
Sure.
And I fully support him in that latter belief, because I could never do that either.
Is the rationale in that, I won't pledge allegiance to the flag. It doesn't have, okay, what I'm doing is relaying what I've heard from others who take a similar position, so I'm interested in knowing whether, the way you think about it is the same or different or similar. So I'm thinking of a person who said, well, I don't pledge allegiance to the flag, and this has nothing to do with disrespect for the country. I pray for the president. I pray for the country's leaders. I wish the country to do well. I want to be a good citizen in that I will obey the laws and I can contribute to the country by being a good citizen, by working hard. But I simply, and this person is drawing on what he knows of, the early church, when Christians in the empire were told to recognize the genius of the emperor, and they refused, simply saying, we pledge allegiance to one being, and that is, Jesus Christ, God the Father, the Trinity. We pledge allegiance to them, and we're not able to pledge allegiance to anything else. And that's his position, that I pledge allegiance to God, and I can't pledge allegiance to anything else. That doesn't mean I disrespect it. It doesn't mean I hate it. It doesn't mean I want to tear it down. It just means, and I want to be as good a citizen as I can, but ultimately, my real citizenship, my primary citizenship, is in a kingdom not of this world, and that's the empire to which I pledge allegiance. Does that resonate with you?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does, very much. My instinct about nation state as a category is that every nation state that exists has as its ultimate purpose its self-preservation. And every nation state will accordingly do. I have yet to see a nation state that doesn't. If you can show me one that doesn't, that would be something different. But I have not yet discovered a nation state whose ultimate goal is not self-preservation, which means that ultimately every nation state will use violence to preserve its existence. And that is what I cannot do as a follower of Jesus. I cannot imagine how, as a follower of Jesus, I could take the life of another person who may also be a follower of Jesus. I simply cannot conceive of how it could ever be right to take the life of another human being.
I hear you. And that's what, yeah, that's what pledging allegiance to the state could require.
That's what pledging allegiance to the state would require. I That's what I believe that it would require of me. If I pledged allegiance to the state, then I would be beholden to do what the state asked me to do, namely to go to war on its behalf. And Mennonites have struggled with this for a long time. In fact, the very ancestors that lie behind me came to the New World, North America, in the early 18th century, in the early 1700s, some of them, a few of them, perhaps in the late 1600s. But my ancestors probably came in the first half of the 18th century, from 1700 to about 1750, somewhere within that time frame. And one of the important reasons that they were coming from Switzerland, my ancestry is largely Swiss, I think. And one of the important reasons that they were coming was so that they could get away from the need to enter into warfare. They were not participants, as far as I'm aware, in the War of Independence. And one of the things that they did early in their history was to publish a book called The Martyr's Mirror. It was written about Anabaptists who were persecuted and martyred for their faith. And during the time of the Revolutionary War, Mennonites in Pennsylvania decided that they needed to translate this and have it accessible so that their young people would have a story about people who refused to kill other people. They would have a narrative that could impact them and that could give them the image of their ancestors in the faith who had suffered and died because they were not willing to go to war.
You can see behind me, I've got the helmets here, but the more I talk to combat vets, the more I just understand that war is just absolute insanity. It's the incarnation of evil and human stupidity in the world. There's nothing to, and combat vets overwhelmingly are going to be the first people to say this.
This is a story that happened in the parking lot of a grocery store a number of years ago. I had a sticker on the back of my car that said, "War is not the answer." I came out to my car to get in it after buying my groceries, and there was a man who was walking through the parking lot, and he took a look at my car and he said, "I agree with that," or something like that. I forget exactly what his words were. Something to the effect that he agreed with that. And he said, "I was in Nam." And so I took from that he was a Vietnam veteran and he saw that war was not the answer.
You know that phrase, "there are no atheists in foxholes." But you know
Mhm.
what's striking is how few combat veterans will say that they felt that God had anything to do with the world of war. It's almost like combat is a God-free zone. In fact, I talked to one veteran who served in Afghanistan who said that when he was going into a situation that would probably lead to a battle, he would pray and say goodbye to God, and then would, sort of this idea of the world of combat as a God-free zone, which is one definition of hell. I mean, hell is the absence of God. War is hell, you know. Um,
Well, yeah, it just seems so completely outrageous to me to think of people going out in some public place or wherever it is and having as their purpose to kill the other people that are there. And the most absurd, I mean, it's not possibly the most, well, maybe it was the most dangerous, but when I think about the way that classical warfare used to take place with people lining up in lines and proceeding towards each other with the goal of killing the person that you're proceeding towards, the absurdity of it is so great I can't even imagine, especially when there were guns. Um, I can't, I don't have words for how insane it seems to me to do something like that. Um,
yeah,
let alone the fact that I can't, I don't have anywhere in my system that I can imagine the idea of killing another human being. Human beings have been created by God, and it's not my business to kill them. I knew deep down in my being that I belonged to a faith community where people refused all acts of violence because of the example and the command of Jesus. I knew that I belonged to a faith community where one early Anabaptist, Dirk Willems, even reached out to rescue his captor from drowning in a frozen lake. And I knew as well that I belonged to a faith community where people, Dirk Willems included, suffered to the death for their beliefs because he eventually was recaptured and eventually executed. So he lost his life for saving this man, where he could have run off across the ice. This was in the Netherlands. But anyhow, simply to say that I was aware as I was growing up that I was a part of a community that held certain sorts of beliefs. That is my history. My history is that I come out of this community where I almost literally can't remember when I didn't. I mean, sure, I can remember times when I was so young that I wouldn't have understood such things, but since I've been able to think about such things, I have known that I belong to this community where people refuse to go to war.